The stagecoach rattled into Placerville, California, on a blistering July afternoon in 1869, carrying a woman who would change everything Garrett Pierce thought he knew about loneliness. And she stepped down onto the dusty street without speaking a single word anyone could understand. Garrett had been leaning against the post outside the general store, his worn boots crossed at the ankles, watching the stage arrive like he did most days when he had nothing better to occupy his time. At 26 years old, he had spent the better part of a decade working cattle ranches throughout California, saving every dollar he could until he finally had enough to buy a small spread just outside town. The land was his, the cabin was his, but the silence that filled both had become a weight he carried everywhere. The woman who descended from the coach was unlike anyone Garrett had ever seen in Placerville. She wore clothing that spoke of a different world entirely. Dark fabrics embroidered with intricate patterns in colors that seemed too vibrant for the dusty California landscape. Her black hair was pulled back in a style he did not recognize, and when she turned to retrieve a single worn bag from the driver, Garrett caught sight of her face. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with dark eyes that held an expression somewhere between determination and fear. "Thank you," she said to the driver, but the words came out in a language that made several townspeople stop and stare. It was not Spanish, which Garrett knew well enough from his years working alongside vaqueros. It was something else entirely, flowing and musical in a way that made him straighten up from his lounging position. The driver, a grizzled man named Herbert who had been running this route for 15 years, looked just as confused as everyone else. "Madam, I do not understand what you are saying," he said slowly, as if speaking more clearly would somehow bridge the gap between them. The woman's face fell slightly, and she tried again, this time in what might have been a different language, though Garrett could not be sure. When Herbert just shook his head apologetically, she pressed some coins into his hand, more than the fare would have cost, and turned to face the town with her bag clutched tightly in both hands. Garrett found himself walking toward her before he had made any conscious decision to do so. There was something about the way she stood there, alone and clearly lost, that pulled at something deep in his chest. He had been alone for so long, but at least this was his country, his language, his home. This woman had none of those things. "You need help?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away and removing his hat in a gesture his mother had drilled into him years before she passed. The woman turned those dark eyes on him, and he saw hope flicker across her face before confusion took over. She spoke again in that same flowing language, gesturing at the town and then at her bag, clearly trying to communicate something important. Garrett looked around, noticing that a small crowd had gathered, the way crowds always did in small towns when something unusual happened. Martha Henderson stood outside her boarding house, wiping her hands on her apron. Doc Reynolds had paused on his way to make a house call. Even young Timothy Walsh had stopped sweeping outside his father's saloon to watch. "Does anyone know what language she is speaking?" Garrett called out, feeling protective of this stranger in a way he could not quite explain. Martha stepped forward, her weathered face thoughtful. "Sounds like it might be Russian," she said. "We had a family pass through here about 5 years back, and they spoke something similar. But I do not know more than a few words myself." Russian. Garrett turned the word over in his mind. He knew that Russian immigrants had been coming to California, especially after the gold rush, though most had settled further north. What was this woman doing in Placerville alone? The woman had been watching this exchange intently, and when she heard Martha say Russian, she nodded eagerly and spoke rapidly, pointing at herself and saying what sounded like Rosa. "Rosa," Garrett repeated, and was rewarded with a brilliant smile that made his heart do something complicated in his chest. He pointed at himself. "Garrett, Garrett," she said, the hard consonants sounding different in her accent, softened somehow and more musical. Then she launched into what was clearly an explanation of why she was here, gesturing and speaking as if the sheer force of her words could make them understand her. Martha stepped closer, her maternal instincts clearly taking over. "The poor dear. She needs a place to stay, that much is clear. I have a room at the boarding house." She looked at Rosa and mimed sleeping, her hands pressed together against her cheek. Rosa seemed to understand this universal gesture and nodded, but then she pulled out a small purse and showed it to Martha, speaking in Russian again. Even without understanding the words, Garrett could tell from her tone that she was worried about money. "I will pay for the room," Garrett heard himself say, and ignored the way Martha's eyebrows shot up. "Just for a few nights until she gets situated." "That is very generous of you, Garrett," Martha said, her tone suggesting she thought it was something more than generosity. "Come along then, dear. Let us get you settled." Rosa looked between Garrett and Martha, clearly uncertain. Garrett tried to think of how to communicate what was happening. He pointed at Martha, then at a building down the street, then mimed sleeping again. "Place to stay," he said, then realized she had no idea what those words meant, but Rosa seemed to understand the gestures well enough. She turned to Garrett and spoke again in Russian, her tone warm and grateful, and even though he could not understand the words, he felt their meaning in his bones. She was thanking him. "You are welcome," he said, then felt foolish because of course she did not understand that either. As Martha led Rosa away toward the boarding house, Garrett stood in the street watching them go. Doc Reynolds sidled up beside him, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "Well now, that was interesting. She needed help," Garrett said defensively. "That she did. And you stepped right up, which speaks well of you. But son, you realize that woman does not speak a word of English. How exactly do you plan on helping her beyond paying for a room?" It was a fair question, and one Garrett did not have an answer for. He settled his hat back on his head and tried to sound more confident than he felt. "I will figure something out." Doc Reynolds chuckled. "I am sure you will. Just be careful, Garrett. This town talks, and that woman is going to need more than just idle gossip to contend with." Garrett knew the doctor was right. Placerville was a good town, but it was still a small town, and a foreign woman arriving alone would be the subject of every conversation for weeks. He found himself already feeling protective of her, wanting to shield her from the curiosity and potential judgment of people who did not understand what might have driven her to travel so far alone. That evening, after Garrett had finished his errands in town, he found himself walking back past the boarding house. Through the window, he could see Rosa sitting at the dining table with Martha, attempting to communicate through gestures and drawings. Martha had paper spread out, and Rosa was sketching something, her face animated as she tried to explain. Garrett did not go in. It would not have been proper, and besides, he had no idea what he would say even if language were not a barrier. But he thought about her all the way back to his ranch, and as he did his evening chores, feeding his horses and checking on the small herd of cattle he was building, his mind kept returning to those dark eyes and that look of determined hope on her face. The next morning, Garrett rode into town earlier than usual. He told himself it was because he needed to pick up supplies from the general store, but he knew he was lying to himself. He wanted to check on Rosa to make sure she was all right. He found her sitting on the porch of the boarding house, a cup of what was probably coffee in her hands, watching the town wake up around her. She looked less frightened than she had the day before, but there was a sadness in her posture that made Garrett's chest ache. "Good morning," he said, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. Rosa looked up and her face transformed when she saw him, a smile breaking across her features like sunrise. "Garrett," she said, standing up quickly and setting down her cup. She spoke in Russian, a stream of words that sounded happy but which he could not understand at all. "I wish I knew what you were saying," Garrett said honestly. "I wish I could talk to you." Rosa tilted her head, watching his face as he spoke. Then she did something unexpected. She placed her hand over her heart and said, "Rosa." Then she pointed at him and said, "Garrett." Simple, but it was communication. Garrett found himself smiling. He pointed at the cup she had been holding. "Coffee," he said clearly. Rosa repeated the word, her pronunciation careful. "Coffee." "That is right," Garrett said encouragingly. He pointed at the porch they were standing on. Porch, at the street, street, at his horse tied nearby. Horse. Rosa followed each gesture, repeating the words, porch, street, horse. Then she pointed at the sky and said something in Russian, looking at him expectantly. "Sky," Garrett told her. "Sky," she repeated, then pointed at the sun rising over the mountains. "Sun," Garrett said. They continued like this for several minutes, a simple exchange of words that felt somehow profound. When Martha came out to check on them, she found them both smiling, caught up in this basic act of communication. "Well, this is a good start," Martha said approvingly. "Though if you are going to help this girl learn English properly, Garrett Pierce, you might want to get yourself a book or something. You cannot just point at things forever." "Do you have any books that might help?" Garrett asked. Martha considered. "I have an old primer that I used to teach my youngest to read. It has pictures and words together. I suppose that might work." "Could I borrow it?" Garrett asked. "You can have it," Martha said. "Lord knows I am not going to use it again. But Garrett, are you sure about this? Teaching someone a whole language is not a small undertaking." Garrett looked at Rosa, who was watching their exchange with curious eyes, trying to follow a conversation she could not understand. "I am sure," he said. What Garrett did not say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that he had not felt this sense of purpose in years. The ranch kept him busy, but it was solitary work. This, helping Rosa, teaching her to communicate, felt like something that mattered in a way that went beyond just day-to-day survival. Martha brought out the primer, a worn book with childish illustrations, and Garrett spent the rest of the morning sitting on that porch with Rosa, going through the pages. He pointed at the picture of an apple and said the word. Rosa repeated it. They moved on to simple objects, basic things that she would need to know. Other townspeople passed by, and Garrett could feel their curious stares, but he ignored them. Rosa was focused entirely on the book, her finger tracing the words as she tried to connect the sounds Garrett made with the letters on the page. She was clearly intelligent, picking up patterns quickly, and Garrett found himself impressed by her determination. By noon, Martha brought them both lunch and Rosa tried out her new words. "Thank you," she said carefully to Martha, and the older woman beamed. "You are very welcome, dear," Martha said, speaking slowly and clearly. "You are learning fast." Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Garrett would ride into town each morning, and he and Rosa would spend hours working on English. She was a dedicated student, practicing everything he taught her and always hungry for more words, more ways to express herself. Slowly, haltingly, Rosa began to tell her story. She was from a small village in Russia. She managed to convey through a mixture of her growing English vocabulary and gestures. Her father had died, leaving debts. Her mother had passed years before. There was an uncle in San Francisco, a man who had left Russia long ago. Rosa had saved every kopeck she could, and when a man in her village offered to arrange passage to America, she had taken the chance. But when she arrived in San Francisco, she discovered the address she had for her uncle was old. The people living there now had never heard of him. She had spent weeks searching, using her limited funds, until she realized she was running out of money and had no way to support herself in the big city. Someone had suggested she try the smaller towns in the gold country, places where people still needed workers and might be willing to take a chance on a foreigner. "So you came to Placerville," Garrett said, and Rosa nodded. "I come Placerville," she repeated, her English still halting but improving every day. "Need work, need stay." "What kind of work did you do in Russia?" Garrett asked, speaking slowly so she could follow. Rosa thought about how to answer. "So," she said, miming the action with her hands. "Make clothes, fix clothes, good so." Martha, who had been listening from the doorway, perked up at this. "We could use a seamstress in town," she said. "Mrs. Chen does alterations, but she is getting on in years and complains about her eyes. Rosa, dear, would you like to work? Make money?" Rosa understood enough of this to nod eagerly. Yes, work, make money, yes. And so Rosa found her place in Placerville. Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come to California during the gold rush and stayed to build a life, was grateful for the help. She and Rosa communicated in a mixture of gestures, broken English, and sheer determination, and it turned out that Rosa's skills with a needle were exceptional. Word spread quickly, and soon she had more work than she could handle. But Rosa still met Garrett every morning before she started her workday, and every evening after she finished. They would sit together, sometimes on Martha's porch, sometimes walking through town, and Garrett would teach her new words, new phrases, helping her navigate this strange country she now called home. As summer faded into fall, Garrett realized that his feelings for Rosa had grown into something he had not expected. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she was. It was not just that he admired her courage and determination, though he did. It was something deeper, something that had grown from all these hours spent together, watching her face light up when she mastered a new word, hearing her laugh when she mispronounced something, and he gently corrected her. He was falling in love with her, and the realization terrified him because he had no idea if she felt the same way. She was always happy to see him, always eager for their lessons, but was that gratitude, friendship, or something more? Garrett tried to push these feelings aside and focus on being her teacher and friend. Rosa's English was improving rapidly, to the point where they could have actual conversations now, though she still struggled with complex grammar and often had to pause to find the right word. One evening in late October, they were walking along the creek that ran just outside town. The air was cooling, autumn settling over the mountains, and the leaves on the cottonwoods had turned gold. Rosa had been quiet, which was unusual for her. She usually had 100 questions, always wanting to learn new words, new ways to express herself. "You are quiet today," Garrett observed. "Is something wrong?" Rosa stopped walking and turned to face him. The setting sun caught in her dark hair, and Garrett had to resist the urge to reach out and touch it. "Garrett," she said slowly, carefully, "I want to say something, but I not know words." "Try," he encouraged. "I will help you." She took a deep breath. "In Russia, when I young, my mother teach me." "How you say? Songs for children, lullabies," Garrett suggested. "Yes, lullabies," Rosa said, testing the word. "She sing in Russian, beautiful, make me feel safe, feel love." She paused, struggling with how to continue. "Here, America, I learn English, I speak English." Is good is important, but is not my heart language. Garrett felt something shift in his chest. "Your heart language," he repeated softly. "Yes," Rosa said, looking relieved that he seemed to understand. "English is head language, I think, I work, I talk to people, but Russian is heart. When I sad, when I happy, when I feel big things, I think Russian first." That makes sense, Garrett said. English is not your first language. It will probably always feel different than Russian. Yes, but… Rosa trailed off, frustrated. She switched to Russian, speaking quickly, passionately, then caught herself and switched back to English. Sorry, is hard explain. Take your time, Garrett said gently. They had sat down on a large rock by the creek, and he was acutely aware of how close they were sitting. Rosa looked at her hands, folded in her lap. You teach me English. You so patient, so kind. Every day you help me. I am grateful, Garrett, so grateful. She looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his heart race. But sometimes, I want to say things, important things, and English words feel wrong. Feel not enough. What do you want to say? Garrett asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Rosa held his gaze for a long moment, and Garrett felt like he could fall into those dark eyes and never find his way out. Then she shook her head. I not of words yet, in English or Russian. They sat together as the sun set, not speaking, just being together in comfortable silence. But something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement of feelings that neither of them was quite ready to name. That night, lying in his bed at the ranch, Garrett made a decision. If Rosa's heart language was Russian, if that was the language of her deepest feelings and truest self, then he needed to learn it. He needed to be able to meet her in that space, to understand her not just in the language she was learning, but in the language she had always known. The problem was, he had no idea how to learn Russian. There were no books at the general store, no teachers in Placerville who could help him. But Garrett had never been one to give up easily. The next morning he rode to Rosa's boarding house earlier than usual, and when she came out surprised to see him so early, he said, I want you to teach me Russian. Rosa blinked at him in surprise. You want to learn Russian? Why? Because it is your language, Garrett said simply. You have worked so hard to learn mine, I want to learn yours. Something shifted in Rosa's expression, a warmth spreading across her face that made Garrett feel like he had just won something precious. You want to learn from me? Yes, Garrett said. Will you teach me? Rosa's smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. Yes, yes, I teach you. And so their lessons took on a new dimension. Rosa still worked on her English, but now Garrett worked on his Russian too. It was harder than he had expected, the sounds foreign in his mouth, the alphabet completely different from anything he had ever seen. Rosa wrote out the Cyrillic letters for him, teaching him how each one sounded, and Garrett practiced them until his hand cramped. No, no, Rosa would say, laughing, when he mispronounced something particularly badly. Is like this. And she would repeat the word, and Garrett would try again, and eventually, slowly, he began to pick up basic phrases. The townspeople noticed the change in their relationship, the way they sat with their heads bent together over books and papers, the way they would sometimes speak in a mixture of English and Russian, filling in gaps in each other's knowledge. Martha watched with approval, while some of the other townspeople whispered about propriety and the strangeness of foreigners. But Garrett did not care what they said. All he cared about was the way Rosa's face lit up when he managed to say something correctly in Russian, the way she would clap her hands together in delight and praise him. You learn fast, she told him. You good student. I have a good teacher, he replied. By December, they could have simple conversations in Russian, though Garrett still struggled with verb conjugations and often had to ask Rosa to repeat things. But the important thing was that he was trying, and Rosa appreciated that more than she could express. It was a cold December evening when everything changed. They had been walking together after Rosa finished work, bundled in coats against the winter chill. Garrett had been practicing a particular phrase all day, working on getting the pronunciation exactly right, and as they reached the boarding house he stopped her. Rosa, he said, his heart pounding. "I want to say something to you, in Russian." Rosa turned to him, her cheeks pink from the cold, her eyes curious. "Okay." Garrett took a deep breath and switched to Russian, speaking slowly and carefully. "Я тебя люблю." I love you. He had practiced those 3 words more than any others, wanting to get them exactly right. Rosa froze, her eyes going wide. "What you say?" Garrett repeated it, his accent still heavy but the words clear. "Я тебя люблю, Rosa. I love you." Rosa's hand came up to cover her mouth, and Garrett could see tears forming in her eyes. She responded in rapid Russian, too fast for him to follow, and when she saw his confused expression, she switched to English. "You say right. You say in Russian. You learn my language to tell me this." "Yes," Garrett said. "I wanted to say it right. I wanted to say it in the language of your heart." Rosa made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she was in his arms, holding him tight, speaking into his chest in a mixture of Russian and English. "I love you too. Я тоже тебя люблю. I love you so much, Garrett. I love you." Garrett held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her warmth against him, and thought that he had never been happier in his entire life. When she pulled back to look up at him, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and reverent, and she kissed him back with all the passion of someone who had been waiting for this moment as long as he had. "Marry me," Garrett said when they finally broke apart. "Rosa, will you marry me?" "Yes," Rosa said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, yes." They married in January of 1870 in a small ceremony at the church in Placerville. Martha stood as Rosa's witness and Doc Reynolds stood as Garrett's. Rosa wore a dress she had sewn herself, beautiful and elegant, and Garrett wore his best suit, the one he had bought years ago and rarely had occasion to wear. The pastor, who had learned a few Russian phrases specifically for the occasion, stumbled through them gamely, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed Rosa with all the love he had been holding inside for months. The small gathering of townspeople who had come to witness the ceremony clapped and cheered, and even those who had been skeptical about the match had to admit they had never seen a couple more clearly in love. Garrett brought Rosa home to his ranch, and she immediately set about making the cabin into a home. She added curtains she had sewn, brought in plants and small touches that softened the rough bachelor quarters Garrett had lived in for years. They communicated in a mixture of English and Russian, sometimes switching mid-sentence, creating their own unique language that was a blend of both their worlds. Rosa continued her seamstress work, taking on clients from all over the area. Her skill became well known, and people would travel from other towns to have her make or alter their clothes. Garrett continued working his ranch, building his herd, making improvements to the property. But the best part of every day was when they would come together in the evening, sitting by the fire, talking about their days. Sometimes Garrett would practice his Russian, and Rosa would correct his pronunciation with gentle patience. Sometimes Rosa would ask about an English phrase she had heard in town but did not quite understand, and Garrett would explain it to her. But mostly they would just talk about everything and nothing, about their dreams and plans and hopes. In the spring of 1870, Rosa discovered she was pregnant. She told Garrett in Russian first, the words tumbling out in her excitement, and then in English when she remembered he did not know all the vocabulary yet. Garrett picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy, and Rosa laughed and held onto him and felt like her heart might burst with happiness. Their son was born in December of 1870, a healthy baby boy with Garrett's dark blonde hair and Rosa's dark eyes. They named him Gabriel, and Garrett held him with shaking hands, awed by the tiny life they had created together. "He will learn both languages," Rosa said firmly, looking down at their son nursing at her breast. "He will speak English like his father and Russian like his mother. He will have both worlds." "That sounds perfect," Garrett agreed, running a gentle finger over Gabriel's soft cheek. And Gabriel did grow up bilingual, switching effortlessly between English and Russian, sometimes mixing them in the same sentence in a way that made both his parents laugh. The ranch prospered, and Garrett's herd grew. Rosa's seamstress business became so successful that she eventually had to hire an assistant, a young woman from town who was eager to learn the trade. In 1872, Rosa gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace. She had Rosa's dark hair and Garrett's lighter eyes, and she was fierce and determined from the moment she entered the world. 2 years later came George, who was quieter than his siblings, but just as loved. The children grew up hearing stories of how their parents met, how their father had learned Russian to tell their mother he loved her in the language of her heart. They heard about the courage it took for Rosa to travel across the world alone, about Garrett's patience in teaching her English and his dedication in learning Russian. Placerville grew and changed around them, but the Pierce Ranch remained a constant, a place where 2 languages were spoken and 2 cultures blended seamlessly. Rosa never lost her accent, and Garrett never quite mastered all the subtleties of Russian grammar, but it did not matter. They understood each other in ways that went beyond words. Other Russian immigrants began settling in the area, drawn by word that there was a woman from the homeland who had made a good life here. Rosa welcomed them, helping them learn English, connecting them with work, offering advice and support. The small Russian community that grew up around Placerville looked to Rosa as a leader, someone who had walked the path they were walking and had found success. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1880, Garrett surprised Rosa with a trip to San Francisco. They left the children with Martha, who doted on them like they were her own grandchildren, and spent a week in the city, just the 2 of them. On their last night, they stood on a hill overlooking the bay, the lights of the city spread out below them. Garrett held Rosa close and she leaned back against him, comfortable and content in his arms. "You ever regret it?" Garrett asked softly. "Leaving Russia, coming here?" Rosa was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Then she turned in his arms to face him. "I miss my country sometimes," she said honestly. "I miss things about home, but Garrett, you are my home now, you and children. This life we build together I not regret, not ever." Garrett kissed her forehead. "I love you," he said in English, then in Russian. "Я тебя люблю." "I love you too," Rosa replied, mixing both languages the way they always did. In English, in Russian, in any language, "I love you always." They stood there together, looking out at the city where Rosa had first arrived in America, lost and alone and frightened. It seemed like a lifetime ago, another world entirely. And in a way it was, that Rosa had been brave but alone. This Rosa had a family, a home, a whole life built from courage and love and the dedication of a cowboy who had learned her language just to tell her he loved her right. Years continued to pass in comfortable rhythm. Gabriel grew into a tall young man who had his father's way with horses and his mother's head for business. He eventually took over much of the ranch operations, allowing Garrett to slow down as his body reminded him he was not as young as he used to be. Grace proved to have inherited her mother's skill with a needle, and by the time she was 16, she was creating designs that had wealthy women from Sacramento requesting her work. George, quiet and thoughtful, became a teacher, helping educate children in Placerville and the surrounding areas, and he made sure every child who wanted to learn could access books and learning, regardless of their family's wealth. In 1885, something remarkable happened. A letter arrived from Russia, forwarded through several addresses, worn from its long journey. It was from a cousin of Rosa's, someone she had not heard from since leaving Russia 16 years earlier. The cousin wrote that she had been searching for Rosa for years, wanting to know what had happened to her, and had finally traced her through contacts in San Francisco. The letter opened up correspondence between Rosa and her remaining family in Russia. It was not the same as being there, but it connected her back to her roots in a way she had not expected. She would write long letters in Russian, telling them about her life in California, about Garrett and the children, about the community they had built. And they would write back with news from home, stories of people she had known, changes in the village. Garrett would often find her sitting at the kitchen table, writing her letters, sometimes with tears on her cheeks. He would rest a hand on her shoulder, offering silent comfort, understanding that these were complicated emotions, loving her new life but missing elements of her old one. "Maybe we should visit Russia someday," Garrett suggested once, "when the children are all grown and settled. We could go see where you came from." Rosa looked up at him, surprised. "You would do that, travel so far, for you?" "Yes," Garrett said simply. "You crossed an ocean to get here. I can cross one to see your homeland." Rosa stood and wrapped her arms around him, holding tight. "You are good man, Garrett Pierce, best man." But they never did make that trip to Russia. In 1887, when Garrett was 44 and Rosa was 41, Garrett was injured in an accident while breaking a new horse. The horse spooked and threw him, and he hit his head on a fence post. Doc Reynolds, now quite elderly himself, did what he could, but Garrett's recovery was slow and difficult. Rosa barely left his side during those long weeks. She would sit by his bed, holding his hand, talking to him in Russian and English, telling him stories, reading to him, praying in the language of her childhood. The children took turns sitting with their father too, and the whole community rallied around the Pierce family, bringing food, helping with the ranch work, showing the same kindness that Garrett had shown to a frightened immigrant woman almost 20 years earlier. Slowly, painfully, Garrett recovered. He never regained quite the same strength he had before, and he had headaches that would plague him for the rest of his life. But he was alive, and he was home, and he could still hold his wife and watch his children grow and work his land. "You scared me," Rosa told him one night when he was finally well enough to sit up and have real conversations. "I think maybe I lose you, and I not know what I do without you." "You would have survived," Garrett said, squeezing her hand. "You are the strongest person I know, Rosa. You would have grieved, but you would have gone on. You would have raised our children and run the ranch and continued living." "Yes, I survive," Rosa agreed. "But I not want just survive, I want live with you, need live with you." "Well, you are stuck with me," Garrett said, pulling her down for a kiss. "I am not going anywhere." And he kept that promise. They had 28 more years together, years filled with the ordinary joy of a life well lived. They watched Gabrielle marry and have children of their own. They watched Grace open her own dress shop in Sacramento, becoming one of the most sought-after designers in Northern California. They watched George become the principal of the school in Placerville, shaping young minds and carrying forward his mother's belief that education could change lives. They celebrated holidays with their growing family, the cabin that had once been too quiet for Garrett now filled with the noise and chaos of grandchildren. They celebrated in American traditions and Russian ones, creating a unique blend that honored both their heritages. On quiet evenings, they would still sit together by the fire, and Garrett would speak to Rosa in Russian, his accent much improved from those early days but never quite perfect. And Rosa would respond, and they would switch to English, and then back to Russian, their conversation a dance between languages that reflected the dance their whole life together had been. In the summer of 1915, when Garrett was 72 and Rosa was 69, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains they had spent their entire married life looking at. Their hands were weathered and worn, marked by decades of hard work, but they fit together perfectly, fingers intertwined. "You remember," Garrett said softly, "that first day you arrived in Placerville, when you stepped off that stage and looked so lost?" Rosa laughed, the sound still musical after all these years. "I was so scared. I not know where to go, what to do. Then you come over, take off your hat, and even though I not understand words, I understand kindness. I fell in love with you that day, I think," Garrett said. "Or at least I started falling. By the time I realized what was happening, it was far too late to stop it. Not that I wanted to stop it." "I fall in love when you say you want learn Russian," Rosa said. "I think this man, he not have to do this, but he do it for me. He learn my language so he can speak to my heart. How I not love that man. Best decision I ever made," Garrett said. "Learning Russian. Though I never got as good at it as you got at English." "You got good enough," Rosa said, patting his hand. "You got good enough to say important things. To raise bilingual children. To help me when I am sad and missing Russia. That is more than good enough." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors change in the sky. 4 decades and more had passed since they first met, and they had been good years, full of love and challenge and growth. They had built something beautiful together, a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. "Ya tebia lublю," Garrett said, the phrase as natural to him now as breathing. "I love you too," Rosa replied. "Always and forever in any language." As the sun finally dipped below the mountains and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained there together. Two people who had found each other across an ocean and a language barrier, who had built a love strong enough to cross any distance. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of growing things and the promise of tomorrow. And Garrett and Rosa, hand in hand, heart to heart, knew that whatever tomorrows they had left, they would face them together, just as they always had. Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1917, at the age of 74. Rosa held his hand as he took his last breath, and she whispered to him in Russian, telling him she loved him, telling him she would see him again someday. The whole town of Placerville turned out for his funeral, testament to the respect he had earned over his decades of honest living and kind dealing with everyone he met. Rosa lived for 5 more years, staying in the home she and Garrett had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her fiercely. She continued sewing almost until the end, her hands remembering the motions even when her eyes grew dim. She would tell stories to her grandchildren about the old country, about their grandfather who had been so patient and kind, about the courage it took to build a new life in a strange land. On a warm spring evening in 1922, Rosa called all her children to her bedside. Gabriel came from the ranch that had once been his father's and was now his. Grace came from Sacramento, leaving her thriving business in the hands of her capable assistants. George came from the school, his students given the day off so he could be with his mother. "I am ready," Rosa told them in English, then repeated it in Russian. "I am ready to go be with your father. Do not be sad for me. I have lived good life, long life, happy life. Your father and I, we build something beautiful together. Now you carry it forward. You teach your children English and Russian. You teach them about courage and love and building bridges between different worlds. Promise me." Through tears, all 3 of her children promised. And that night, with her children holding her hands, Rosa Orlova Pierce closed her eyes and slipped away, a smile on her weathered face. They buried her next to Garrett, and on the headstone they inscribed both their names, along with the dates of their lives and a simple phrase in both English and Russian. Love crosses all barriers. The Pierce family did carry forward the legacy their parents had built. The children taught their children Russian and English, passing down the language and the stories. Grace's great-granddaughter would eventually write a book about Rosa and Garrett, preserving their story for future generations. The ranch remained in the family for over 100 years, and visitors would sometimes stop and ask about the unusual headstone with its bilingual inscription. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right through the cottonwoods, people claimed they could hear two voices carried on the breeze, one speaking in English and one in Russian, laughing together like old friends, like lovers who had found each other across impossible distances and had never let go. The small Russian Orthodox church that Rosa had helped establish in Placerville in the 1880s still stood well into the 21st century, a testament to the community she had helped build. Inside, there was a plaque honoring her memory, describing her as a pioneer, a mother, a businesswoman, and most importantly, as someone who had shown that love and courage could overcome any obstacle, any distance, any difference in language or culture. Because in the end, that was the story of Rosa and Garrett, not just a story of a cowboy who learned Russian to tell a woman he loved her right, though it was certainly that. It was a story about building bridges, about the courage it takes to love across differences, about the patience required to truly understand another person. It was about two people who had started out unable to communicate, but who had worked, day by day, word by word, to build a language of their own, one that was bigger than English or Russian alone. It was a story about home, and how home is not always a place, but sometimes a person. For Rosa, home became Garrett, became their children, became the ranch and the community they built together. For Garrett, home became Rosa, her laughter and her strength and the way she looked at him like he was the best man in the world. And it was a story about love, the kind of love that does not give up, that does not take the easy path, that looks at barriers and sees challenges to be overcome rather than walls that cannot be crossed. The kind of love that says, I will learn your language, I will meet you where you are. I will put in the work because you are worth it. Years and decades after they were both gone, the story of Garrett and Rosa Pierce lived on in Placerville, passed from generation to generation, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always ending the same way, with a cowboy learning Russian just so he could tell a frightened immigrant girl that he loved her in the language of her heart. And every time the story was told, someone listening would feel their own heart swell a little, would think about the people they loved and how they showed that love, would remember that the truest form of devotion is not the grand gesture, but the daily choice to understand, to connect, to speak to another person in the language they best understand. That was the legacy of Garrett and Rosa Pierce. Not just the children they raised, or the business they built, or the land they worked. Their legacy was in every person who heard their story and decided to be a little braver, a little more patient, a little more willing to cross the distances that separate people. Their legacy was in the reminder that love is not always easy, but it is always worth it. That understanding takes time and effort, but the connection it builds is stronger than anything else. That home is wherever you choose to build it, with whoever you choose to share it with. And so, as the sun sets over the California mountains, as it has set every evening for hundreds and thousands of years, the story of a cowboy and a Russian immigrant who found each other against all odds continues to echo. A reminder that the human heart speaks a universal language. But sometimes, learning someone's specific language is the truest way to say, I see you. I honor you. I love you. The Pierce family ranch still operates, now run by Gabriel's great-great-grandchildren, who speak English primarily but who all learn at least some Russian, keeping alive the tradition their ancestors started over a century and a half ago. They tell visitors about Garrett and Rosa, about how their love story began with an act of compassionate kindness and grew into something that shaped not just their family but their entire community. In the end, that is what love does. It starts small, with one person reaching out to another, with patience and kindness and a willingness to bridge the gap between different worlds. And if you are lucky, if you are brave enough and patient enough and willing to do the work, that small beginning grows into something magnificent, something that echoes down through generations, something that changes the world in ways both big and small. Garrett and Rosa Pierce understood that. They lived it every day of their lives together. And their story, a story of language and love and bridging impossible distances, continues to inspire everyone who hears it. A reminder that the best love stories are not about people who are perfect for each other from the start, but about people who are willing to work to understand each other, to meet each other halfway, to learn each other's languages and speak to each other's hearts. And somewhere, beyond the veil that separates this world from whatever comes next, two souls rest together, no longer separated by language or distance or anything else, united in the perfect understanding that comes when two people have spent a lifetime learning how to love each other right.